Our first story begins deep in the wild, untamed forests of the Pacific Northwest. These dense woods hold many secrets, but none more terrifying than the story of James, an experienced hiker who vanished without a trace one autumn afternoon. James was no stranger to the wilderness. For years he had navigated these remote trails, always returning with stories of his adventures. But in September 2012, something changed. That day, James set out alone, as he often did, promising his wife he'd be back by Sunday evening. He never came home. The search began immediately. Friends, family, and local authorities combed the forest for days, using every tool at their disposal: helicopters, dogs, and even thermal imaging drones. But all they found was his campsite. His tent was zipped from the inside, untouched, as if he had just stepped out for a moment. His backpack sat neatly beside it, still packed with food and supplies, but James was nowhere to be found. As night fell on the second day of searching, an eerie chill crept through the search party. Strange things began happening. Several searchers reported hearing whispers in the trees, though no one else was around. Others felt like they were being watched, as though unseen eyes followed their every move. Then came the footprints. Bare feet, too large for an animal, too small for a grown man. They led away from the campsite, deep into the part of the forest that the locals had warned about, a place they called the Whispering Woods. They said no one who ventured into those woods ever came back the same, or at all. The search team followed the prints, hoping for a breakthrough, but just as suddenly as they appeared, the footprints stopped, as if James had vanished into thin air. The authorities concluded he had gotten lost or fallen victim to the wilderness, but those who know the forest, they tell a different story. Some say the forest took him. Others say something else lives there, something that does not let its victims escape. To this day, not a single trace of James has been found. But every now and then, hikers in that same area report hearing strange voices on the wind, and they see footprints, bare, human-like footprints, leading deeper into the woods, only to disappear, just as James did. Our second story takes us to a quiet town in Connecticut, where an antique doll with a sinister past brought terror into one woman's life. Sarah had always been fascinated by vintage items, so when she stumbled upon an old porcelain doll at a local thrift store, she couldn't resist taking it home. The doll had a crack running down its face and one glassy eye that seemed almost too lifelike. But Sarah didn't mind. She placed the doll on a shelf in her living room and forgot about it. That night, however, something strange happened. Sarah woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. Thinking it was just her mind playing tricks on her, she went back to sleep. But the next morning, she noticed something odd. The doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it sat on the coffee table facing the front door. At first, she dismissed it, thinking she had simply forgotten moving it herself. But then, the incidents escalated. Objects in her house would shift positions, lights would flicker, and every morning she would find the doll in a different spot, staring at her with that cracked, lifeless face. One night, Sarah decided to lock the doll in the attic. She couldn't bear the eerie feeling it gave her anymore. But just hours later, she was jolted awake by a loud thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from above. They were slow, deliberate, almost as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth. She hesitated, but eventually worked up the courage to check the attic. As she slowly opened the door, she saw it. The doll was sitting on the top step, its cracked face pointed directly at her. How it had gotten out of the box, she didn't know, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something far worse was about to happen. In a panic, Sarah grabbed the doll and threw it out on the street, leaving it next to the trash bins. The following morning she drove away, relieved to be rid of it. But just as she looked in her rearview mirror, there it was, standing upright in the middle of the road, staring back at her. That was the last time she saw the doll, or so she thought. Shortly after she moved to another state, strange occurrences began happening again. Her belongings would go missing, only to reappear in strange places. And every once in a while she could swear she heard soft footsteps in the hallway at night. To this day, Sarah wonders if the doll has truly left her, or if it's still watching. Our final story is perhaps the most terrifying, because it could happen to anyone. This is the story of Jenna and Matt, a couple living in a suburban neighborhood in Chicago. Their nightmare began one quiet night when Jenna woke up with a feeling of dread. You know that feeling, when someone is watching you. She glanced around her bedroom, her eyes adjusting to the dark, and that's when she saw it. In the corner of the room, a tall, shadowy figure stood motionless. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But then, it moved. Only slightly, but enough for her to know it wasn't her imagination. Jenna froze in fear, unable to look away. The figure had no face, no features, just a tall, dark shape. She tried to wake Matt, but before she could even move, the figure vanished. The next morning, she told Matt what she had seen, but he didn't believe her. He reassured her it was probably a dream, but Jenna knew it wasn't. For the next few nights, the figure appeared again and again, always in the same corner of the room, always watching her. Matt remained skeptical, until one night, he woke up to something far more terrifying. He heard breathing, slow, heavy breathing, right next to his ear. When he opened his eyes, he saw it, the shadowy figure looming over Jenna as she slept, its hand inches from her face. In a panic, Matt reached for the bedside lamp, and the figure disappeared, leaving only the suffocating darkness behind. Terrified, they contacted a paranormal investigator who told them that their house had a history. A man had died in that very room years before, his body found slumped in the corner. The investigator tried to cleanse the house, but the figure didn't leave. To this day, Matt and Jenna still see it sometimes, standing in the corner just watching. And each night they wonder if it's getting closer. These stories may sound like nightmares, but for the people who lived them, they were all too real. In a world full of shadows, we often forget that the scariest things aren't the monsters under our bed, but the ones we cannot see. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you want to hear more true, spine-chilling stories, be sure to subscribe to Spooky Stories. New tales of terror await you every week. And remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't in your nightmares, but right behind you. Good night, and sleep tight.